So very briefly, my name is Wauters. I'm a European technology journalist. I've been covering the scene for about 10 years. TechCrunch, the Next Web, and now my own publication. I did a presentation this morning on the Inspire stage about some data that, particular to Europe, about growth of startups and the momentum that we have in capital specifically. So I'm going to pull some of these things that I shared on stage and we'll discuss these. That's what the panel is about. But first, brief introduction. Who are you? What do you do? Where are you based?
Yeah, so Zoltan, Hopka, I work for EBRD, which is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which has a technology VC facility based in London. And we invest into companies from the Baltics all the way down to Turkey and in between. Technology company with development based in one of those countries, serving, I guess, any kind of international market, and Series A and onwards to growth stage.
Hello. My name is Jan Habermann. I'm partner with Credo Ventures, based out of Prague, Czech Republic, and investing in early stage tech companies throughout the region.
Hi, hello, I'm Kristjan Laanemaa from Karma Ventures. We are a team based in Tallinn, Estonia, and we have a fund investing in seed and Series A stage, and we really prefer deep technology companies, and we have done 5 investments since we launched last year.
Hi, Tuomas Kosonen from Inventure, based in Helsinki, Finland. So we have a team in Helsinki, Stockholm and Shanghai. We do technology investments quite broad scale, seed and early stage, and active portfolio of 38 companies, so a lot of things to do.
All right, so mostly early stage, mostly regional, so that's already a topic of discussion, I guess. One thing I like to say is it's always good to have all men on a panel. Obviously that's not your fault, but maybe someone from the organization is listening. I'm sure we can find some interesting women next time for a panel like this as well. I hope you agree. But back to the topic at hand. I presented some data this morning that essentially said that last year, European startups, when I say Europe, I include Russia, Turkey, and Israel, just for good measure. But all in all, we had about 16.2 billion euros raised between startups in the year, full year, which still pales in comparison to the US and China, etc. But quite linear growth across the years. We've been tracking since 2012. It was about 6 billion, so that's a pretty good curve. And I'm guessing you also, as investors, you feel this momentum happening in Europe as well, or not? You do, or you don't?
It goes back to the original question, I guess, in terms of is the future bright or not? Well, I think it's a hard ball, so I think I'll slam it immediately. I think it's bright, otherwise we shouldn't be in this room, anyone. Well, I think we certainly feel the momentum in at least the region that we look after. Not so much just on the fundraise, but also on the startup stage. But I think if you look at different ecosystems, especially kind of in Europe, they all kind of develop in a different manner. It is getting obviously much more competitive, not just from a funding, but from a company perspective as well. So I think in terms of is the future bright, it is definitely bright. I think it's easier to start a company than has ever been. There's a ton of knowledge that's being shared from the US, from around the world to kind of get things going. But I think once to get to day 2, it actually starts to get amazingly competitive. So I think the kind of the skill set and that's required to do well has really changed, I think, from today even to 2-3 years ago, how people should be kind of thinking.
So I don't want to go one by one all the time, so I'll just mix it up. Maybe Tuomas, the Nordics obviously punching above their weight in general, especially Stockholm and Helsinki. Do you feel this momentum as well? What do you think has changed? What do you think was the catalyst for this momentum? Because I think it started about 5 years ago. You saw the numbers go up tremendously, but also the interest in entrepreneurship, policymakers getting more interested. So what happened? Was there a catalyst, or was it a gradual change?
Well, it's been quite gradual in that sense. So we'll be following the market for now 12 years. And back in the days when we started, there wasn't the ecosystem in place. But now, the new university that was created, the Aalto University behind the Schloss, for example, so growing from 20 people to 20,000 people, just showing the example, and a lot of new initiatives. So the state in Finland especially, so they were copying the Israeli model with their own accelerators and trying to create those as a venture fund. Some of them succeeded pretty well as well. And so there's been like bits and pieces overall, which has been gathering that. And of course, the great returns, especially in Sweden. So like it's, and Estonia branding themselves the unicorn factory of the world and like Stockholm, the unicorn capital of the world. So, and both have some examples of that one. So like it's a lot of like good things happening, and of course now it's just accelerating with great examples, and of course the spin-offs from those success stories, which will create the new ones.
Jan, maybe you can comment as well, because you see all this stuff happening in the Baltics and the Nordics. Central Europe is kind of, it's interesting, but it seems to be a little bit behind on the curve. Would you agree or not?
I wouldn't actually. I think that we have had some very interesting companies originating out of Central Europe even 5 or more years ago. And we do see a significant trend that we're seeing more and higher quality of startups nowadays as well. If you look at statistics, I think that statistics for this region are not very precise. There's a lot of activity that goes beyond the traditional data providers. They don't notice. So that is slightly subjective impression. I cannot support it by many data, but maybe some by anecdotal evidence. This region has over last year seen a couple quite interesting financing rounds led by either large funds from Western Europe or from the US, and rounds in amounts, either high millions or actually even tens of millions. So I think there's a lot of happening here.
You mentioned higher quality of startups. That translates to me a higher quality of entrepreneurs. Do you think founders right now are more ambitious than they used to be 5-10 years ago in Europe? And what has changed that they are more ambitious? Maybe Kristjan?
I think Estonia is a good example how these really large, successful companies breed another generation of entrepreneurs. I think in Estonia, like Skype, TransferWise, companies like GrabCat that have been relatively successful over the long run, they have generated a new layer of entrepreneurs who see that, okay, this stuff is possible, so I'm going to give it a shot and I'm going to do it. Plus, they have had experience in these large companies, which means they know how to build these types of products, they know how to scale them. So the quality is definitely rising. And this, it's a cycle. If you have more these types of entrepreneurs, more quality, you get more money in the market. People who didn't invest into early stage before, they come into the business as well. And I don't mean only like general partners managing VC funds, but also limited partners. They see that these types of successes is possible. These are not only projects on PowerPoint slides, but some of them become really, really successful, and the fund managers have generated returns, so it creates this kind of positive cycle.
Definitely agree, but I will say that for a long time at least, in these smaller ecosystems, in Copenhagen you have Zendesk, in Estonia you have GrabCat. These companies are actually born there, but they need to go to the US, and even the founders move to the US often to scale the business, which is normal. But the question is, should we strive in Europe to create environments where eventually founders will not have to move and be able to stay in Europe, or does that not really matter?
Well, I think that's a very relevant question, and we might have different views on it. The way our thesis was, and I think many people's thesis is that this region, Europe, parts of Eastern Europe in particular, has got good engineering skill set, it's got good product capability. I think some of the early successes from the region actually were built on that. And then, of course, at some point they had to flee to the US to get for sales and marketing skills. And I think that when we talked about kind of the second generation entrepreneurs coming along, they're obviously following this principle, what they've seen. But hopefully at some point there's going to be an inflection point. I think, again, this is massive generalization, but where people think in terms of the product. Obviously you can't get around it, but you will start to think about your go-to-market strategy as well from sort of day one. And I think where we are at the moment, we still see lots of companies with superior products, quite often more superior than what you see a comparable one in the US, but probably lacking in terms of how we're going to sell this. There's probably less kind of entrepreneurial spirit in Europe. There's less kind of know-how. But I think that's probably the next kind of phase of change that we need to see.
And to continue from that one, so it's not only US, at least from our perspective. So we opened our business development unit in China for the portfolio companies back 5 years ago already. And we have since that seen some of the portfolio companies having quite great success, especially on the deep tech and so like hardware side on the Asian markets. And Chinese, as you told us in the morning as well, so they are getting more active. We now have sold 2 companies to China as cash deals, and they are getting active in Europe. And so it's not just the US, it's the nature of the company, which for the software company, from our experience, it's quite challenging and stuff to get to Asian markets, especially in China. But on the if you have anything to do with the strong patent portfolio or hardware, so it makes sense to look other way around as well.
And I did mention that this morning indeed. It's not just Chinese, it's also Japanese. Rakuten, for example, making big investments, doing big acquisitions here in Europe. Is that necessarily a good thing for Europe, though? I mean, it might be a good thing for the founders to have a really nice exit and for the investors. But in the long term, shouldn't some of this technology and these people stay in Europe to really make the ecosystem stronger?
Yeah, sure, of course. So all the continents are now competing with each other, but it's the same question with are the US acquirers much better than the European ones? At least the companies that we've been involved, so it hasn't changed that dramatically after the acquisition. Actually, it has stayed in Finland or Sweden, the operations, and they've been investing heavily on that side as well, keeping the technology where it's originally from. Of course, they're going to use it and scale it in their own market and use it for their purposes, but I don't see that that's a big threat as such. Information is flowing back and forth anyway.
Well, I don't think there's anything to add to this. I very much agree. I mean, the startups, the founders or the companies should follow where their business is. And if they need to go elsewhere because their customers are there, I think that's a good thing to do.
Makes sense, of course. Do you feel, probably in certain regions in Europe that's not the case, but I feel sometimes when we talk about capital, especially in places like London and Berlin, there's almost like a saturation on the early stage. You have accelerators, angel investment, professionals banding together. Companies like AngelList, you have incubators, you have Rocket Internet, seed funds, VC firms. But I feel like once you go up the scale and you go up Series B, Series C, then the gap kind of surfaces. And then for those late stage rounds, you often need to go abroad and even private equity firms to find funding. But do you feel that there is an oversaturation on the early stage level? And not just in your regions, but in general in Europe? Maybe Kristjan?
I think it depends market by market. I think, for example, in Scandinavia, there's
a little bit closer to.
Yeah, I think in Scandinavia the gap is much smaller because you have early stage funds, you have state support, and then you have big funds like Credo, North Zone. You Inventure are going into larger deals as well. So there, it's less of a problem. But for example, as much as I have been here in Poland, here we see that there are many really early stage funds backed partly by European Union, partly by government. But when you go from the seed upwards, there's a lot of room, and that's, I guess, we are all here. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
So I would say that I would very much agree that the seed or pre-seed capital in Europe, in this region, and in the US probably as well, is very crowded. There's a lot of capital available for that stage. And I think particularly in our region, what's missing is some sort of late seed, not even Series A or Series B. I think the companies that are able to get to this stage won't have any problems to raise more capital. But some of the seed-funded companies funded by investors who don't have large funds may be actually underfunded and may not get enough cash to ever get to Series A. Obviously, many of them wouldn't deserve more funding in any case, but some of them, should they have more cash, could actually make it to Series A. So I would say there is an opportunity for more funds in sort of late seed. There will be many opportunities in this region, in my view, in next 1, 2, or 3 years.
You mentioned some companies, especially in the early stage, get funding even if they don't really deserve or need it. And sometimes it even kills the companies for obvious reasons. If you don't need the money and you raise it anyway, that's probably not always a good option, right? But what's interesting about this, especially in certain regions in Europe, that means public money, taxpayer money, is going to in these startups that don't necessarily, they should never raise money, but they do anyway because there's so much options for them. And I want to go to you with that question because you must have an interesting view on the division between public and private funding, especially in the early stage.
Well, I mean, my view, that where the money comes from is probably secondary. I think what it comes with is the paramount importance. I think part of the oversaturation on the early, the seed and the early stage that you referred to, I think is probably a natural evolution because a lot of the, probably with the exception of Estonia and some countries, this ecosystem didn't exist. And so I think it's probably obviously a logical thing to sort of start creating the ecosystem there. I think, and in many countries where we've seen in kind of broader Central Europe, it's more about the, the people who ended up using those money and investing, and the practices that they are establishing is the key thing. And later on, at the end of the day, it's a market-driven, and the risk here is all kind of commercial-driven. So the type of entrepreneurs that are identified, that are given a chance, and then the type of kind of advice that they receive. Obviously, the bad scenario is when it's more of a private equity type sort of approach at a very early stage. And the good scenario is, in our view at least, is the more the supportive type kind of environment. But I think over time, this will have to change. And I think the second generation entrepreneur is a key factor in many of the countries because they always either felt it on their own skin, how far they took it, so they have a bigger hunger, a bigger appetite. And I think Europe is clearly playing a bit of a catch-up game, but we have to sort of, move beyond that very, very quickly because no one is competing in the European market anymore. I think whatever you do, you are competing on the global stage. And that's how I think entrepreneurs are thinking today.
So let's stay on this topic, public-private, just one more minute. Maybe Tuomas, you have a view on this? Because I know in Finland, the government's heavily involved in funding early stage startups very early on through Tekes. Do you feel like you compete against them? Do you work with them? Do you feel like funding should be coming from public resources either way?
Yeah, the Finnish system has been quite generous on that side, and so the institute that you mentioned, Tekes, so they are granting R&D loans and grants, and that is something that I think all of our Finnish portfolio companies have benefit out of. So and I see that of course it's, if not just continents, it's countries competing with each other as well, where you have the locations and where you have the R&D. So that is pretty good. So one thing which took place last year, that the state was pretty active, the most active seed investor, and with their own fund, and that was actually privatized and sold. So now that's back on the normal terms, competing with the others. So and at least I want to keep that system. So, and that's something which attracts actually talent to Finland as well. So I've been having discussions even today here. So people have thinking should they establish a company due to Tekes? And if we are taking the bright minds out with the companies and selling them outside as well, so we have to import something as well. So therefore it makes sense. And I suppose that inside the EU, when all the countries are considering something similar. And that's my point.
There was one thing that I wanted to add, is that in early stage, the death rate is quite high, or kind of the survival rate is quite low, because there are kind of many early stage ideas, very few of them actually raise follow-on funding, even fewer of them get to an exit. So the topic of the panel being bright or night, then really many entrepreneurs, there's always a feeling that there's too little money and there's nights outside. But overall, I think the kind of funding amount growth in really early stage is beneficial for all, because then you have more entrepreneurs that can try to execute their plans, and then the kind of top of the pyramid also kind of gets wider because more get through. But in essence, let's take like our pipeline. We reviewed something like 800 projects last year, or kind of funding deals, and less than 1% actually got a term sheet, and even less got to a final deal. So the kind of it's really kind of cutting off many. The ones that don't get money, for them, the situation seems like miserable.
To continue exactly the same thing what you're just saying, it's quite tough actually to get to the super growth. And so to continue with the tech, so it used to be like maybe 2-3 years ago still, that some of the companies were actually like doing tech business, not like getting customers money or anything. They were just going from one project to another one and trying to finance themselves through that one, and that was their main goal. So the only target that is to get additional funding from public side. So like that's now been a change, and which makes sense, of course. So it shouldn't be like living debts that the state is supporting.
So going back to the actual startups, one argument that's not in favor of Europe, and I find that it's true, is the lack of talent, not necessarily technical talent or early stage or developer or engineer, but the kind of talent that can scale companies, the kind of people that have already gone through the process of building a product for millions, maybe tens of millions, hundreds of millions of users. We don't really have that generation yet. We're now starting to have a generation of entrepreneurs who built it, but we don't have a deep enough talent pool to go around for everyone. And I think especially in smaller countries in Europe, smaller ecosystems, it's very, very difficult if you have a company that's finally scaling to find the talent in their respective markets, but also to convince foreign talents to come to these places. If you have the appeal of a London or a Barcelona or a Paris, it's completely different from a Prague, even though it's a lovely city. It's completely different from getting people to come to Prague or even Helsinki or Riga. So that's a challenge, I think, for smaller companies. And then I think government policy can make a lot of difference. But do you find that in your portfolio companies you run into that problem sometimes, where basically you need talent that knows how to scale, to market, to do sales on a higher level than you're used to?
So definitely. And the typical solution within our portfolio is that they actually build offices, sales offices, or C-level offices outside the region, because it's not easy to get really senior people, and the experience in this region is limited. There's not enough people who would be able to serve all these companies that are appearing here. So that's an issue. If there's any solution for that, I think time will cure this. The more companies will be built, the more experience will remain in the region, but it's an evolution that will take a couple more years.
I agree with you. I think, especially with the smaller country. I mean, in terms of VC investable countries in Europe, I think in terms of individual countries, it's very, very limited. I mean, it's UK, France, Germany, Spain, Turkey. All the other countries basically have to think beyond the borders to build big businesses. So I think and scaling them in this environment. So I'm taking this as the base case, the European scaling. It's a completely different approach to scaling a business into Europe because of all the different policies and governments. So actually, we'll have to figure out a way. And there are certain business models which can relatively easily scale. We have some investments, and you guys, I'm sure, have as well. But it's not replicating what the US is or China is. So I think we'll have to kind of find people, and we need entrepreneurs who are totally comfortable, whether they come from Slovenia or Central Europe, or to basically attract and keep people at the company. So it is definitely a challenge. I think going over to the US, it's a totally different ballgame from the Europe. It changed kind of the core structure of the company as a different level, the type of backers you need. So, but again, money doesn't solve anything. If you have an entrepreneur, I think resilience is the key. And that's why I think today, a couple of years ago, the early companies which grew big could kind of grow on the back of of a technology. Today, because of a competition, I think we need guys who are very dedicated and figure things out. With government money, with private money, or whatsoever, they will find their way. So.
I wanted to add that if the question is how to attract commercial talent that helps to scale these companies, then one way how we think about it is that if you invest in technology or product that has really strong advantage and it is really unique, then good people that have worked in the industry in larger companies in the same sector typically want to come over and help the company to scale and grow. So the more advantages you have in the market, the better these guys understand that, okay, if I go into this startup, I have really a good chance of building another leader. So that's why we as investors also look for, companies that are, unique, that stand in front of the competition. It's always easier to get good people then.
Tuomas, same question though. Have your portfolio companies run into this problem? And if yes, how do you think we can fix it?
Of course, we have faced the same problem as everybody else is. Some companies had gone abroad, tried to find the talent there. Some of them have just spread their networks all over the place and try to manage it, or of course educate people as well. But that is especially on the commercial side, so sales marketing, that is something that we are lacking, at least in Finland. So it's a bit better maybe in other Nordic countries, but that is the most important thing that we invest is people anyway, so not the technology as such. So we're that's an ongoing process to find the right people, the right places, the best talent.
We're going towards the end of this panel, but I wanted to touch on something that I mentioned this morning as well. Atomico put out a report during Slush at the end of last year, and one of their arguments was where everyone thought that the hubs in Europe would centralize and go around London, Berlin, Stockholm, etc., and Paris. What's actually happening is you see these deep tech, machine learning, expertise hubs being built around knowledge centers like universities in Zurich or whatever. Do you think that's an evolution that's going to continue? That Europe's actually going to become more fragmented rather than more centralized in terms of ecosystems? Anyone?
I say that there is so much hype around this one, so that trend won't slow down in the next years. Of course, we need success stories to support it and money and all the resources that are needed. But I don't think that any people just want to be in this business or build something with their own minds. So I don't see that slowing down and concentrating. Some of these larger hubs are quite expensive and difficult to recruit, so it's impossible to actually build from scratch something there. So I think it's going to be spread out.
I see also that many companies have an ideal that it's really good to be in this big hub, but then they figure out that it's quite difficult to find people there, especially development resources, and it's really expensive to be there. So they start looking what are the other alternatives, and that's how, for example, Copenhagen and Helsinki are becoming kind of attractive suddenly.
Yeah, I think that's a go.
Can I ask just one more question? Startups, is their future in Europe bright or night? If it's bright, raise your hand. See, they're VCs, they're optimists. Good, thank you very much.